Morning, everyone. Today we are going to look at the speech called The Birth of a Nation, which was given by Martin Luther King Jr. So, this is a speech which talks about the African nation of Ghana and how Ghana was able to break away from the British Empire and become an independent nation. So, as you already know, probably Martin Luther King Jr. was a prominent American figure who worked for the rights of Black Americans. Um, so, even though America had abolished slavery under the guidance of Abraham Lincoln, um, there was never any equality between the white people and black people of America. So even as late as the 20th century, in the 1950s and 1960s, Black Americans were treated completely unjustly by the American, government and also by, most of the states in America. So Martin Luther King, he led a movement called the Civil Rights Movement, which wanted to reclaim the rights of Black Americans. Okay. And he was inspired by the teachings of Mahatma Gandhi, and he was also a person who visited, various nations which were becoming independent during that time, including India. So he was inspired by, how the people of these nations were struggling, and ultimately they were able to, reclaim their independence. Okay. So this sermon, this is a speech which is in the form of a sermon, SERMON. A sermon is actually a religious speech, right? It is given by a preacher, somebody who wants to religiously inspire his listeners. So Martin Luther King Jr., he was a church minister. Right? He belonged to the Baptist church, and he was a father. Um, and his speeches are all in the form of these sermons, which connect political issues and social issues along with religious understanding as well. Okay. So what happens in this speech is Martin Luther King Jr. Remembers the story of the Exodus. Now, the Exodus is the story from the Old Testament of the Bible, which talks about how Egypt was ruled by the pharaohs, and these pharaohs were very powerful kings, and they were also very cruel, and they were especially cruel to the Jewish people who worked as slaves, in Egypt. And Moses, wanted to liberate these Jewish people. He wanted to lead them out of Egypt into a promised land. But the Pharaoh said, "No, I will not let you go." Right? He said, "You cannot go away from my kingdom." So Moses prayed to God, and God decided to punish Egypt. And one by one, a series of disasters started happening in Egypt. And finally, the Pharaoh was forced to let the people go. Okay. So that biblical story is used as a inspiration by Martin Luther King Jr., and he connects it to how the people of Ghana and other nations, including India, protested against colonialism, and finally they were able to liberate themselves. Okay. So let us now go into the text. Let us first look at a brief biography of Martin Luther King Jr. Okay. So Martin Luther King Jr., he was born on January 15th, 1929, and he was assassinated on April 4th, 1968. So he was an American Baptist minister and activist who became the most visible spokesman and leader in the civil rights movement from 1955 until his assassination in 1968. So he was a Baptist minister. A Baptist is somebody who belongs to a certain subgroup within Protestant belief. So most of the American Christians belong to the Protestant faith, because initially Protestantism emerged in England, but England was ruled by Catholic kings, and they did not allow Protestantism to be practiced. So most of the colonists, the early colonists of America, they were fleeing England in order to practice Protestantism. Okay, so he was the leader of the civil rights movement, which was this political movement from 1954 to 1968, which worked to abolish racial segregation. Segregation is the forced separation of black people from other, white people, right? So in America, there was this, very unjust treatment of black people. They were not even allowed to use the same buildings or toilets or even schools which were used by the white people. Okay, so that was what was called the segregation, racial segregation. Okay, so an African American church leader and son of early civil rights activist and minister Martin Luther King Sr., King advanced civil rights for people of color in the United States through non-violence and civil disobedience. So he was the son of a church minister. He was born in a very religious family. His father was also a priest. So he was inspired by the principles of non-violence and civil disobedience. So what does this mean? Civil disobedience means the non-violent breaking of laws. So as a protest against the government, you break the laws, but in a non-violent way. So this was inspired by his Christian belief and the non-violent activism of Mahatma Gandhi. So King was one of the leaders of the 1963 March on Washington, where he delivered his famous I Have a Dream speech on the steps of the Lincoln Memorial. So this I Have a Dream speech, it is a very famous speech which was delivered by Martin Luther King. And there he says, in that speech he says, I have a dream that one day black children and white children will be able to grow up together. I have a dream that one day America will be united as a nation. So like that, it's a very famous speech. You can actually hear that speech on YouTube, right? You just have to search for the speech. Okay. Okay, so at the age of 35, Martin Luther King Jr. became the youngest man to have received the Nobel Peace Prize. Okay, so that was in 1964. When notified of his selection, he announced that he would turn over the prize money to the furtherance of the civil rights movement. Okay. On the evening of April 4, 1968, while standing on the balcony of his motel room in Memphis, Tennessee, where he was to lead a protest march in sympathy with striking garbage workers of that city, he was assassinated. So he was killed in 1968. Okay. So during his life, as I said, Martin Luther King Jr. had visited a number of African countries and also Asian countries. And one of the countries that he was most inspired by was Ghana, Ghana. Okay. So he visited Ghana on several, occasions. And after returning from Ghana, after its independence, after it gained independence, he delivered a speech called The Birth of a New Nation. And this lesson, this extract is taken from that speech. So here you see a map of Africa, and you can see the small, green dot or that shaded place. That is Ghana. That is the country of Ghana. Okay. So upon returning from Ghana, King used several occasions to share his experiences with his friends and supporters in Montgomery. Montgomery is a city in America. The following excerpts are taken from the sermon titled The Birth of a New Nation, and it was delivered on April 7th, 1957. So this was his first sermon following his return, and King draws upon Exodus, like I said, the story of the Exodus, to frame his impressions of Ghana's battle against colonialism. So you all know what colonialism is, right? So Western nations, including England, had colonized various parts of the globe, and they were exploiting the nations. Okay, so that is colonialism. He elaborates on the spiritual and political significance of the new nation's independence movement. Ghana has something to say to us. It says to us first that the oppressor never voluntarily gives freedom to the oppressed. You have to work for it. Okay. So Martin Luther King is using the example of Ghana to talk about certain important things, or to remind his listeners that freedom is something that you have to, work hard for. It is never just given by the oppressor. So you have to really struggle in order to win freedom. King asserts that desegregation would not occur without the same determination. So just like Ghana had to work hard, the people of Ghana had to work hard in order to gain freedom, the people of America, the black people of America, will have to really struggle and work hard in order to put an end to segregation, right? This practice of separating black and white citizens. Okay, so now let us go into the speech itself. Okay, so let us begin with what King is saying. I want to preach this morning from the subject, the birth of a new nation. So this is a sermon. So that is why he is using the word preach. To preach means to deliver a religious speech or a sermon. Okay. I would like to use as a basis for our thinking together a story that has long since been stenciled on the mental sheets of succeeding generations. So he says he is going to use a story that has been stenciled. Stencil means etched, something which has been engraved on the minds of the people for many generations. Okay, so it's an old story which has great significance and importance to people. Okay. So what is the story that he is using? It is the story of the Exodus, the story of the flight of the Hebrew people from the bondage of Egypt. Bondage means slavery, right? So it's a story about how this Hebrew people, Hebrew is another word for Jewish people, right? So from the bondage of Egypt through the wilderness and finally to the promised land. It is a beautiful story. The struggle of Moses, the struggle of his devoted followers as they sought to get out of Egypt. And they finally moved on to the wilderness and toward the promised land. This is something of the story of every people struggling for freedom. Okay, so that is an important point. So according to King, every country, every nation which wants to attain freedom is like the people of Moses. Is like the Hebrew people trying to escape from Egypt. It is the first story of man's explicit quest for freedom, and it demonstrates the stages that seem to inevitably follow the quest for freedom. So this is one of the earliest stories of a whole society wanting to attain freedom, independence. Okay, and it is also a story which tells us that it is not easy, right? There are many difficulties, there are many challenges that has to be overcome in order to win freedom. Okay. So now we go to what happened in Ghana. Okay. Prior to March the 6th, 1957, there existed a country known as the Gold Coast. Okay. So before Ghana became independent, that country was known as the Gold Coast. This country was a colony of the British Empire. This country was situated in that vast continent known as Africa. You know that for years and for centuries, Africa has been one of the most exploited continents in the history of the world. It has been the dark continent. It's been the continent that has suffered all of the pain and the affliction that could be mustered up by other nations. Okay, so King talks about how Africa has been receiving all the affliction. Affliction means suffering that has been gathered up by other nations, especially the Western nations. They have exploited Africa to the fullest, the maximum limit. And it is that continent which has experienced slavery, which has experienced all of the lowest standards that we can think about. And it has been brought into being by the exploitation inflicted upon it by other nations. Okay. So Africa is a very sad example of how human beings can really be extremely cruel to other fellow human beings, right? So these other nations, they have exploited and caused tremendous damage, tremendous loss to the people of Africa. So now King is describing the history, a brief history of the Gold Coast or Ghana. The Gold Coast is a little country there in West Africa, about 91,000 miles in area, with a population of about 5 million people, a little more than 4.5 million. And it stands there with its capital city, Accra. Accra is the capital of Ghana. For years, the Gold Coast was exploited and dominated and trampled over. To trample over something means to walk over something, to completely destroy something. Okay. So this country was destroyed and exploited and dominated by various Western nations. The first European settlers came in there about 1444, the Portuguese, and they started legitimate trade with the people in the Gold Coast. They started dealing with them with their gold, and in turn they gave them guns and ammunition and gunpowder and that type of thing. Well, pretty soon America was discovered, and a few years later in the 1400s, and then the British West Indies. So this was all happening in the 15th century. So initially the Portuguese came to the Gold Coast and they started trading, and then later, after the discovery of America and the establishment of British West Indies, they started a slave trade to the Gold Coast. And all of these growing discoveries, see here, and all of these growing discoveries brought about the slave trade. Okay, so I hope you know what the slave trade is, right? So in order to have workers in the plantations of West Indies and America, black Africans were brought over from various African countries, and they were exploited as slaves. Okay, so slavery was a terrible evil, right? Okay, so in the Gold Coast in particular, not only the Portuguese, but the Swedes and the Danes and the Dutch and the British, and all of these nations competed with each other to win the power of the Gold Coast, so they could exploit these people for commercial reasons and sell them into slavery. So it was not only the Portuguese, but it was also Sweden and Denmark and Holland, and also the British people. All of them exploited the people of this country. Finally, in 1850, Britain won out, and she gained possession of the total territorial expansion of the Gold Coast. So by 1850, Britain had complete authority. Britain had complete domination over this country. From 1850 to 1957, March 6th, the Gold Coast was a colony of the British Empire. So more than 100 years, right? 107 years, it was a colony. And as a colony, she suffered all of the injustices, all of the exploitation, all of the humiliation that comes as a result of colonialism. Okay. So all of these injustices and exploitation and humiliation. Humiliation means shame, right? You don't have any pride when you are a part of a exploited colonial nation. Okay. But like all slavery, like all domination, like all exploitation, it came to the point that people got tired of it. Okay, so this is what happens when you exploit someone. Eventually, people become tired of being exploited. So what happens then? What do people understand? Look at the next paragraph. Men realize that freedom is something basic. To rob a man of his freedom is to take from him the essential basis of his manhood. To take from him his freedom is to rob him of something of God's image. Okay. So this is how Martin Luther King talks about the importance of freedom. Right? Freedom is something very basic to human beings. Right? So when you take freedom from someone, you are depriving that person of the essential condition of life, right? It's the essential basis of our selfhood, our identity. So to take freedom is to rob somebody of something in God's image. It is something divine. Freedom is something which is divine in nature. Then he uses a quotation from Shakespeare's Othello. To paraphrase the words of Shakespeare's Othello, who steals my purse steals trash. It is something, nothing. It was mine, it is his, has been the slave of thousands. But he who filches from me my freedom robs me of that which not enriches him but makes me poor indeed. So this is a dialogue from Shakespeare's play Othello. So Othello is speaking about the comparison between freedom and money. Okay. So if somebody steals your purse, right, it contains nothing but money, and according to Othello, it is just trash. It is something or nothing. It doesn't have any value. Today that money belongs to me, but yesterday it might have belonged to somebody. And money is just the slave of thousands. Right? It just passes from people to people without any change. But if somebody filches means to steal. If somebody steals my freedom, then they are robbing me of something which does not enrich him. So by stealing my freedom, the person who steals it does not become richer. But what happens to me? I become poor indeed. I become extremely poor. Okay. So there is something in the soul that cries out for freedom. So there is something very basic in human beings that values freedom. That is, that has extreme connection or attachment to the idea of freedom. Okay, so now what happened to the people of Ghana? And so these people got tired. It had a long history. As far back as 1844, the chiefs themselves of the Gold Coast rose up and came together and revolted against the British Empire and the other powers that were in existence at that time, dominating the Gold Coast. So right from 1844, the people of Ghana, they did not like the fact that they were being exploited. So even as early as 1844, they were protesting against the ruling powers. Okay. They revolted, saying that they wanted to govern themselves. But these powers clamped down on them. To clamp down on somebody means to exert force, right? They completely crushed that rebellion. You destroy the resistance. And the British said that we will not let you go. Now that continued, and then what happened? About 1909, a young man was born on the 12th of September. History didn't know at that time what that young man had in his mind. His name was Kwame Nkrumah. Okay, so this Kwame Nkrumah, he is like our own, Mahatma Gandhi. He was the person who was most important in the freedom struggle of Ghana. Okay. So his mother and father, illiterate, not a part of the powerful tribal life of Africa. Not chiefs at all, but humble people. So he belonged to a very poor, ordinary family. And that boy grew up. He went to school at Achimota for a while in Africa, and then he finished there with honors and decided to work his way to America. So he was a very, hardworking person who wanted to educate himself. So he wanted to go to America. He started studying there and he started reading the great insights of the philosophers. He started reading the great insights of the ages. So in America, he finally learned about how various philosophers had talked about the importance of freedom, justice, equality, liberty, etc. Right? And he finished there and took his theological degree there. Theological degree means a religious degree. That is a degree that you need in order to become a priest. Right? And he preached a while. He became a preacher. He then took up a master's in philosophy and sociology. All the years that he stood in America, he was poor. He had to work hard. He says in his autobiography how he worked as a bellhop in hotels, as a dishwasher, and during the summer, how he worked as a waiter, trying to struggle through school. So throughout his time in America, he was working very hard, and he had to work in various jobs, like a waiter, a bellhop. Bellhop is an attender, or a dishwasher in various restaurants, just so that he could continue his education. Okay. So finally he decided, I want to go back home. I want to go back to West Africa, the land of my people, my native land. There is some work to be done there. He got a ship and went to London first. While in London, he started thinking about Pan-Africanism. What is Pan-Africanism? It is this political or social movement which wanted to unify all the African people and African nations. Okay. So he started thinking about this Pan-Africanism and the problem of how to free his people from colonialism. For as he said, he always realized that colonialism was made for domination and for exploitation. It was made to keep a certain group down and to exploit that group economically for the advantage of another. So that is the basis of colonialism. It was made to dominate and to exploit. To dominate means to have power over something, right? To exert power. And to exploit means to completely loot the riches, loot the wealth of another people. Okay, so he studied and thought about all this, and one day he decided to go back to Africa. Okay. So finally, Kwame Nkrumah is going back to his native country. He got to Africa and he was immediately elected the executive secretary of the United Party of the Gold Coast. Okay, so this was the dominant political party during that time. And he worked hard and he started getting a following. Following means there was a bunch of people, a huge gathering of people who were following him. And the people in this party, that is the United Party, the old people who had their hands on the plow for a long time, got a little jealous of his influence. To have your hand on the plow means to have control over something. So the old people who were in control of this party, they became jealous of Nkrumah. Okay. And so finally, he had to break from the United Party of the Gold Coast. And in 1949, he organized the Convention People's Party. So this was a new party that he formed. It was this party that started out working for the independence of the Gold Coast. He started out in a humble way, urging his people to unite for freedom and urging the officials of the British Empire to give them freedom. So this was the first work that he did. He united the people and asked them to work for freedom. At the same time, he was also working with the British government, trying to get them to give more freedom to Ghana. They were slow to respond, but the masses of people were with him, and they had united to become the most powerful and influential party that had ever been organized in that section of Africa. Okay. So now that he was the leader of this big following of people, there was a huge popular support for him, and the government, the British government, decided to throw him into prison. The British imprisoned him on the basis of sedition. What is sedition? Sedition is a crime against one's own country. Okay. So the British people, the British government, they accused him of sedition and they threw him into jail. And he was placed there to stay in prison for many years. But he had inspired some people outside of prison. They got together just a few months after he had been in prison and elected him the prime minister while he was in prison and planned to break him out of prison. So what happened? His followers gathered together and they made him the new prime minister, right? The prime minister of the country, and they decided to break him out of prison. When the British Empire saw that they had better let him out, in a few hours, Kwame Nkrumah was out of jail, the Prime Minister of the Gold Coast. So finally, the British government had no choice. If they kept Kwame Nkrumah in prison, then the entire following of people that he had, they will destroy the jail and they will liberate him. So they had to let him out of the jail. So he came out and became the Prime Minister of the Gold Coast. He was placed there for 15 years, but he only served 8 or 9 months. And now he comes out the Prime Minister of the Gold Coast. The British Empire saw that it could no longer rule the Gold Coast, and they agreed that on the 6th of March 1957, they would release this nation. That this nation would no longer be a colony of the British Empire, that this nation would be a sovereign nation within the British Commonwealth. So finally the British had no choice. They decided that Ghana will become an independent nation. Okay, all of this was because of the persistent protest, the continual agitation on the part of Prime Minister Kwame Nkrumah and the other leaders who worked along with him and the masses of people who were willing to follow. So it was a collective effort. It was the entire nation working together for one goal. So that day finally came. It was a great day. This was a great day not only for Nkrumah, but for the whole of the Gold Coast. There then came Tuesday, December the 5th, that is the day before independence. Okay. That night, we walked into the closing of Parliament. Okay. So, Martin Luther King Jr. was also there during that day. He visited Ghana on the eve of its independence. He was there on the day that it became independent. So they all walked into the old Parliament, and that old Parliament was closing. Right? That Parliament belonged to the British system, the British government, and now it was finally being shut down. The closing of the old Parliament which presided over by the British Empire, the old Parliament which designated colonialism and imperialism. So this was the seat of the government which controlled colonialism and imperialism. Now that Parliament is closing. That was a great sight and a great picture and a great scene. We sat there that night, just about 500 able to get in there. People, thousands and thousands of people waiting outside, just about 500 in there. And we were fortunate enough to be sitting there at that moment as guests of the Prime Minister. Okay, so Martin Luther King Jr. was one of the 500 people inside the Parliament during this day, during this historic day. Okay. At that hour, we noticed Prime Minister Nkrumah walking in with all of his ministers, with his justices of the Supreme Court of the Gold Coast, and with all of the people of the Convention People's Party, the leaders of that party. Nkrumah came up to make his closing speech to the old coast. There was something old now passing away. So this was a historic moment because that old system was ending and a new beginning was, starting. Right. The thing that impressed me more than anything else that night was the fact that when Nkrumah walked in and his other ministers who had been in prison with him, they didn't come with crowns and all of the garments of kings, but they walked in with the prison caps and the coats that they had lived with for all of the months they had been in prison. So this was very impressive. They did not come dressed in very fancy, expensive clothes like the kings and queens were, right? Instead, they were wearing the prison uniforms. They were wearing the caps and the coats which they had been wearing in prison. Okay. Nkrumah stood up and made his closing speech to the parliament with the little cap he wore in prison for several months and the coat that he wore in prison for several months and all of his ministers around about him. That was a great hour. An old parliament passing away, and then at 12 o'clock that night we walked out. As we walked out, we noticed all over the polo grounds almost 500,000 people. They had waited for this hour and this moment for years. Okay, so finally, just like the Indian independence happened, right, at the stroke of midnight, that was also when uh, uh, Ghana or the Gold Coast became an independent nation. So as we walked out of the door and looked at that beautiful building, we looked up to the top of it, and there was a little flag that had been flowing around the sky for many years. It was the Union Jack flag of the Gold Coast, the British flag, you see. But at 12 o'clock that night, we saw a little flag coming down and another flag went up. The old Union Jack flag came down and the new flag of Ghana went up. So you might have all seen, this Union Jack. Union Jack is the British flag, right? It has a peculiar cross-like design, right? So that flag was the one which was there at the top of the Parliament building. But on March 6th, with midnight, at the stroke of midnight, a new flag was hoisted. This was the flag of Ghana. This was a new nation now, a new nation being born. And when Prime Minister Nkrumah stood up before his people out in the polo ground and said, "We are no longer a British colony. We are a free, sovereign people. We are an independent people." All over that vast throng of people, throng means gathering, we could see tears. And I stood there thinking about so many things. Before I knew it, I started weeping. I was crying for joy. And I knew about all of the struggles and all of the pain and all of the agony that these people had gone through for this moment. So Martin Luther King Jr. was also moved by this historic event. He was moved so much. It was so emotional for him that he was crying because he remembered the suffering that these people had experienced. After Nkrumah had made that final speech, it was about 12:30 now, and we walked away. And we could hear little children, 6 years old, and old people, 80 and 90 years old, walking the streets of Accra, crying, "Freedom, freedom." So the entire population, from children to extremely old, people, were celebrating the independence, freedom. They were crying it in a sense that they had never heard it before. And I could hear that old Negro spiritual once more crying out, "Free at last, free at last, great God Almighty, I am free at last." So, hearing the cries of these people, Martin Luther King Jr. was reminded of how that old spiritual, Negro, the Negro slave, cried out, when slavery was abolished. What did they cry out? They cried out, "We are free at last." Right? Free at last, great God Almighty, I am free at last. So these lines it will be repeated in many of Martin Luther King's speeches, even in the famous I Have a Dream speech. The same lines are repeated. Free at last, free at last. Okay. They were experiencing that in their very souls. This was the birth of a new nation. This was the breaking loose from Egypt. So just like Moses was able to lead the Jewish people away from Egypt into the promised land, Nkrumah was able to lead Ghana, the Ghanaians, away from colonial past, away from domination into an independent future. Okay. So now we come to the last part of this speech, where Martin Luther King is taking some lessons from Ghana. He talks about what we are reminded of by the example of Ghana's independence. So he talks about 5 main points, 5 things that we should remember when we think about Ghana. So let us look at this. Ghana has something to say to us. It says to us first that the oppressor never voluntarily gives freedom to the oppressed. So this is the first lesson that we learn from Ghana. You will never voluntarily get freedom from your oppressor, and they will not give up their power. You have to work for it. Okay. And if Nkrumah and the people of the Gold Coast had not stood up persistently, revolting against the system, it would still be a colony of the British Empire. Okay. So it is only because Nkrumah and his followers protested. That is why they became independent. Freedom is never given to anybody, for the oppressor has you in domination because he plans to keep you there, and he never voluntarily gives it up. And that is where the strong resistance comes. Privileged classes never give up their privileges without strong resistance. So whenever you try to win freedom, your effort will be resisted by those who are in power. They will try to hold on to power as much as possible. So now we come to the second idea that we get from Ghana. That is the presence of certain people who are willing to sacrifice their own life. Okay. So if there had not been a Gandhi in India with all of his noble followers, India would have never been free. If there had not been an Nkrumah and his followers in Ghana, Ghana would still be a British colony. If there had not been abolitionists in America, both Negro and white, we might still stand today in the dungeons of slavery. Okay. So there were certain people who protested against these systems. In India it was Gandhi, in Ghana it was Nkrumah, and in America it was the people who worked to abolish slavery. So that included Abraham Lincoln. Right? And then because there have been in every period, there are always those people in every period of human history who don't mind getting their necks cut off, who don't mind being persecuted and discriminated and kicked about, because they know that freedom is never given out, but it comes through the persistent and continual agitation and revolt on the part of those who are caught in the system. Ghana teaches us that. So there are always people who will fight for freedom. There are freedom fighters. They don't mind being thrown in jail. They don't mind being executed. They will never give up. Right? It is only through their persistent and continual agitation. Right? They continue to work even if they suffer. And they are the people who are the heroes. They are the ones who win freedom. So that is the second point. Now the third thing that we learn from Ghana is it reminds us of the fact that a nation or a people can break loose from oppression without violence. So it is possible to get freedom without violence. Nkrumah says in the first 2 pages of his autobiography that he had studied the social systems of social philosophers and started studying the life of Gandhi and his techniques. Then he says after he's continued to study Gandhi and continued to study this technique, he came to see that the only way was through non-violent positive action. Okay. So this is what he found out. Nkrumah was a student of Gandhian principles, and just like we know Gandhiji's contribution to non-violence and satyagraha. Nkrumah used that to come up with an idea called non-violent positive action. Okay, so he called his program positive action, and it's a beautiful thing, isn't it? That here is a nation that is now free, and it is free without rising up in arms and with ammunition. So it was not through violence or weapons, ammunition or guns that freedom was won. It is free through non-violent means. Nkrumah says in his book, "When I came out of prison, I was not bitter toward Britain. I came out merely with the determination to free my people from colonialism and imperialism that had been inflicted upon them by the British. But I came out with no bitterness." Okay. So that is a very important idea. Nkrumah did not have any personal grudge or enmity towards the British people. He just wanted to win freedom through non-violent means. Okay. So in order to be non-violent, you even have to love your enemy, right? You should not have any deep hate for your enemy. And because of that, this world will be a better place in which to live. Now, the fourth thing that we learn from Ghana is, there is another thing that Ghana reminds us. I am coming to the conclusion now. Ghana reminds us that freedom never comes on a silver platter. So now he is talking about the struggle for freedom. It is never easy. It never comes with ease. It comes only through the hardness and persistence of life. Ghana reminds us of that. You better get ready to go to prison. When I looked out and saw the Prime Minister there with his prison cap on that night, that reminded me of the fact that freedom never comes easy. So that is the fourth idea that we learn from Ghana. It is always difficult. It is always hard to get freedom. It comes through hard labor, and it comes through toil. Toil means hard work. It comes through hours of despair and disappointment. And now we come to the final idea, the final thing that we understand from Ghana. The road to freedom is difficult, but finally, Ghana tells us that the forces of the universe are on the side of justice. That's what it tells to us now. You can interpret Ghana any kind of way you want to, but Ghana tells me that the forces of the universe are on the side of justice. So this last point is that, whenever there is an inequality, whenever there is some exploitation, the universe itself tries to correct that imbalance, right? Colonialism, slavery, all of these are imbalances. It is unjust treatment of one person or one people by another person or a country. So the universe itself will be with the oppressed, the people who are suffering. And there will be many opportunities, there will be many occasions which is presented before these oppressed people to regain their power, to regain their independence. So let's look at the 5 points once again, the 5 ideas that Ghana tells us. The first one is, you never get freedom voluntarily from the oppressor. Okay. Second is that there are always people who are willing to sacrifice their own life in order to fight for freedom. And the third one is, it is possible to win freedom through non-violence. And the fourth one is, it is never easy to win freedom. It takes a lot of hard work and effort in order to win freedom. And finally, the universe itself is always on the side of those who are exploited, right? It's always on the side of justice. And therefore, we can fight for our freedom knowing that ultimately we will win. Okay. All right. So this, this is the speech. It's not the entire speech. This is the excerpts taken from the speech called the birth of a new nation. Okay. So just go through the underlined points and study the lesson very thoroughly, because questions can be asked from even minute details. So make sure that you read the lesson very closely and pay attention to what Martin Luther King Jr. is saying. Okay. So with this, we will wind up this class, and I'll see you in the next video.